Today we're going to build our first mobile app game, a variation on the traditional fairground whack-a-mole game. So I'll open up my web browser, go to App Inventor. Remember, App Inventor will always open up the previous project you were working on. So let's go to Projects, My Projects, and start a new one. And we're going to call it Mole Masher. I'm going to go full screen here. And looking at my screen design, the first thing I'm going to do is give the screen a title. We're going to be working with graphics in this app, so we're going to drag out a canvas onto the mobile app screen, and this is going to represent a field that the mole lives in. So let's set it to green. I'm going to set the width to full parent, so it fills the full width of the mobile app screen. And the height I'm going to set to 300 pixels, but you choose what works best for your device. I'm also going to rename it as Canvas Field. I'm now going to drag an image sprite onto the canvas. Now this is a graphic that we can work with on a canvas. And I'm going to rename it Image Sprite Mole. And you can see in the Components window how the image sprite is related to the canvas. I'm going to set the image sprite mole's picture property to a picture I have of a mole here. And I'm going to leave everything else as it is. Below the canvas, I'm going to have a start button and a text label to display the score. So to get things side by side, we need a horizontal arrangement component, remember? And I'm going to drag in the button and the label. The button's going to be a start button, so I'm going to rename it Button Start. And the label will display the score, so I'll call that Label Score. And giving components and other things in programs meaningful names is really important because it makes it much easier to identify them when you go back and work with them later. Now setting the properties for each of these, first of all the button, I'm going to set the font to bold, 18 point, and the text start. I'm going to leave everything else at the standard settings. Moving on to the label, I'm going to set it to bold, 18 point to match the button. The text I'll set to score. And lastly, the colour, I'm going to set the text colour to red to make it stand out. The next component I'm going to use is under Sensors, and it's a clock. I'm going to drag this clock component onto my mobile app screen, and because it's not a visible component, because you can't see it, it's listed down below the main app screen here. The purpose of the clock is to use as a timer. Now in computing, a timer is a component which can create an event every so often. In this case, the timer will fire every 1000 milliseconds, every second, and we can change this. And in our game, we're going to use it to move the mole every second. So I'm going to call it Clock Mole Timer. And this is the basis of our game. Finally, when we touch the mole with our finger, we want to play a sound. So let's go into Media, drag over a sound component. Once again, it's a non-visible component, and we're going to rename that Sound Mole Hit. And the sound source is going to be squeak. One last thing. I think my screen would look better with a black background. Now you create this interface, rerun the video if you need to, pausing when necessary. By this stage you should have created the interface for your Mole Masher app, and all we have to do now is create the code. So moving into my blocks editor, the first piece of code I'm going to create is to define a variable. And this is going to be the score variable, and I'm going to give it a starting value of 0. Now this block basically sets up a variable called score. It's available throughout the entire program, which is why it says global there, and initializes it, gives it a starting value of 0. Notice again, just as we did with components, we've given this variable a meaningful name, so it's easy to recognize when we're working with it. Now looking at my algorithm, I'm now going to create the code that moves the mole. And to do this, I'm going to use a procedure. A procedure is a piece of code in a program that does a particular task. And it's like creating your own command within the App Inventor language. So going into the procedures blocks, I'm going to drag out a toProcedureDo block. I'm going to call it moveMole. And this procedure will contain all the code that's needed to move the mole. Notice how we give procedures names that start with an uppercase letter and variables tend to start with a lowercase letter. That's just something that programmers commonly do. It wouldn't stop your program from working if you didn't, but it makes procedures and variables easier to distinguish. And what we want to do here is set the mole's X and Y coordinates on the canvas. So going into Image Sprite Mole, I want to set the image sprite mole's X coordinate to a random place along the canvas. First of all, let's work out the size of the canvas. This is going to be the canvas width minus the width of the mole. But this would make it appear at the same place every time, so we're going to introduce an element of randomness. And App Inventor allows us to create a random fraction. So it's going to be a random fraction of times that amount. And I'm going to do exactly the same for the Y coordinate. But I'm going to cheat here, so right click and duplicate this code block. And I'm going to set the image sprite mole's Y coordinate to a random fraction of the canvas height minus the mole height. So the procedure will move the mole to a random position on the canvas whenever it's called. I'm also going to add a comment here, which will explain what the procedure does. And this is going to be useful to either me when I come back to maintain my code at a later date, or to another programmer who might want to amend my code. And I can show and hide comments in this way, and I can also move them around to another position. I can also collapse a procedure so that it appears as a single line of code. Now this can be useful not just to save space on the screen, but also to treat a procedure as a command. We're kind of zooming out here and saying, I've dealt with that and now have a command to move the mole. I could of course expand the block again and go back into it if I ever needed to make changes to it. Next we're going to create another procedure to update the score. So going into the procedures blocks, drag out a toProcedureDo block, and we're going to call this update score. And every time we update the score, we're going to set the label score text, and going into text, I'm going to join the word score Notice how I put a space there so the actual value doesn't appear right next to the colon, and the value of the variable score. So I'm going to get the value of global score. So this is going to set the label scores text to the word score followed by the value of variable score. So it's going to say score 5, score 6 and so on. And I'm going to add a comment to this procedure too. Now looking at my algorithm, I'm now going to add the code that deals with when the mole is touched. So going into image sprite mole, when image sprite mole is touched, this one here, I'm going to set the score variable to what it was before, so I'll get that value, plus one. So this instruction adds 1 onto the score every time the mole is touched. And once that's been done, my program can call the update score procedure. So this is using the code in the update score procedure above. We're then going to make the phone vibrate, so going into sound mole hit, we're going to call sound mole hit vibrate, and we've got to say for how long, and we'll make that 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, just a short vibration to give feedback to the user. We also want to play the sound for when the mole is hit, so call sound mole hit play, and once the mole's been touched, call up the procedure to move it again. We're now going to create the code for the start button so that when it's clicked, it sets the score to 0 and updates the score display. So going into button start, when it's clicked, the score variable, which we defined earlier, set that to 0. Update the score. Finally, we're going to use the clock timer we created earlier to move the mole every time the clock goes off. So when clock timer fires, move the mole. And that's all the code in our app. So to test your app, either fire up an emulator or live test on a phone. Have fun!